Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I'd like to turn the conference over to Jennifer Bartz. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Thanks, Jamie. I would like to welcome everyone to the fifth and final session of our 2013 National Directors Institute Web Conference Series. We are in our 12th annual NDI season, a program which started in 2002. As with our NDI programs in past years, we are looking forward to sharing the insights and experiences on corporate governance issues that we think matter most to you. The goals and objectives of our NDI program have always been to provide practical insights and useful takeaways to directors, executives, and boardroom advisors. Materials for our previous NDI webinars and other sessions, including PowerPoint presentations and audio recordings, are available on our dedicated NDI website, which is foley.com/NDI. Information regarding NDI webinar sessions in the future will be found on our NDI website as well. And we held our 2013 in-person NDI Executive Exchange in Chicago on November 13th. Please go to our NDI website to find many of those valuable program materials from that program. Our next invitation-only in-person NDI Executive Exchange will be held Thursday, November 6, 2013. Please be on the lookout for more information. At this time, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of our NDI co-sponsors, many of whom have been supportive to NDI for years, and some who are new to our program this year. Aon Corporation, D.F. King & Company, Eversheds, KPMG, and Morgan Stanley, as well as our in-kind sponsors, Boardroom Bound and Inforum Board Access. Today our program is entitled 2014 Proxy Season Preview. With us today is John Wilson. John is a partner in Foley's Milwaukee office and a member of the firm's Transactional and Securities Practice and Energy Industry team. His practice focuses on mergers and acquisitions, corporate financings, and securities law, as well as general corporate matters. He provides continuing advice to a number of public companies in a variety of industries regarding federal securities law compliance, disclosure and reporting, corporate governance, and takeover defense matters. Also with us today is Josh Agan. Josh is a senior counsel from our Milwaukee office. His practice focuses on assisting public and private companies in the areas of executive compensation, employee benefits, corporate transactions, and securities law compliance. Additionally, we have Rick Gruba. Rick is the Senior Vice President at D.F. King & Company. He primarily advises corporations and shareholders involved in complex shareholder transactions, specializing in corporate control situations and proxy contests, mergers, and unsolicited tender offers. Rick also formulates and recommends shareholder communication strategies for public companies in crisis situations. Finally with us today, we have Pat McGurn. Pat provides special counsel to institutional shareholder services. Considered by the industry constituents to be one of the leading experts on corporate governance issues, he is active on the nationwide speaking circuit and plays an integral role in policy development. Before beginning our discussion, a few housekeeping items. Today's program will last approximately 1 hour. The PowerPoint presentation will be available on our website at foley.com/NDI by early next week, or simply click to download a copy of the slides from the Files box along the right side of your screen. If you experience problems with Adobe Connect, please call 888-569-3848 for technology assistance. For audio assistance, dial star, then 0 on your telephone to reach an operator. Today's program has been set up in both a discussion and an interactive question and answer format. We encourage you to submit written questions during the program. Type your question into the Q&A box at the right side of the presentation slides. We will respond to written questions at the end of the program, time permitting. If we do not have time for a Q&A at the end of the program, we will be sure to follow up with you offline. To ensure you get the most out of today's presentation, we encourage all participants to maximize the PowerPoint to full screen usage. You can do so by clicking the full screen button located above the slides. As a reminder, today's program is being recorded and will be available on Foley's website early next week. Foley will apply for CLE credit after the web conference. If you did not supply your CLE information upon registration, please send an email to Jennifer Bartz at jbartz@foley.com. And please note, those seeking Kansas, New York, and/or New Jersey CLE credit are required to complete the attorney affirmation form. A 4-digit code will be announced during the presentation. Email the code to jbartz@foley.com to get a copy of the form, or simply click the download the form from the files box along the right side of your screen. Immediately fill it out and return it after the program. Also note that you must log on to both audio and video to obtain CLE credit. Finally, it can take 6 to 8 weeks for us to obtain all CLE approvals, and we appreciate your patience in this process. And now I will turn the phone over to John Wilson from Foley and Lardner.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks everyone listening for attending our 2014 Proxy Season Preview presentation. Just to give an overview of the agenda, we'll start with a discussion on say-on pay and other compensation issues for the proxy statement. Then we will cover rule changes that are new this year. The good news, if you're a corporate company, is that there are not a lot of them this year. Then we'll end with the corporate governance landscape. Finally, we'll finish, time permitting, with a Q&A session. With that, I'll turn it over to Josh to talk about say-on pay issues.
Thanks, John. So to start off the presentation today, I'd like to kind of set the backdrop for a discussion of say-on pay in 2014 with a brief look back at the say-on pay voting results from 2013. So 2013 was the third year of mandatory say-on pay under Dodd-Frank. The overall approval rates, defined as receiving at least majority support, were about 98%, which is similar to 2012. About 92% of companies received 70% or greater support. And that 70% threshold is relevant because that's kind of the cutoff after, if you fall below 70% approval, you'll be subject to increased scrutiny from the proxy advisors and some institutional shareholders to see if you're doing things to respond to what's perceived as a poor say-on pay outcome. So, but 92% of companies were above that 70% threshold. As it says on the slide, 72% of companies passed with over 90% approval, so it's fairly common to have a very high approval margin for say-on pay. Of those companies who experienced failed say-on pay vote in 2013, one notable feature was that they tended to have a significant drop-off in support from earlier years. I think the statistics are something like an average decline of 33% from their vote in 2012. So that suggests a couple of things. I mean, first, if you have a really high say-on pay vote approval in 1 year, that doesn't mean that you'll be immunized from having a failed say-on pay vote the next year. I think it also suggests that the failed say-on pay votes in 2013 were generally attributable to some identifiable event or series of events or a number of events, but not just sort of a slow and gradual decline in support. So that takes me to my next slide, which is to highlight just kind of the most common reasons for failed say-on pay votes in 2013. I think perhaps the most common factor was poor total shareholder returns. That can contribute to failed say-on pay votes in a couple of ways. I mean, first, it creates a general inclination among investors to vote against management pay, but it's specifically relevant also to the proxy advisor voting recommendations. ISS's pay for performance evaluation and say-on pay looks at a company's relative TSR against its peer group and how that TSR ranking in that peer group compares with the company's pay ranking in the same peer group. If pay is outstripping TSR, you may have what's called a pay and performance disconnect, and that raises a red flag in ISS's voting analysis. And those voting recommendations did continue to be influential in 2013 in terms of there was definitely a correlation between companies receiving a no recommendation from the proxy advisors and companies that had failed say-on-pay votes. Other leading factors included things like insufficiently rigorous performance goals, special awards or mega grants for new hires or other reasons, or other non-performance-based equity that wasn't sort of adequately justified in the eyes of voters. And then the other big category was problematic pay practices. And these are just pay practices that are deemed problematic by the proxy advisors and some institutional investors. Typically, they include practices like gross-ups, excessive severance, excessive change in control payments. It can include excessive perquisites, or a pretty clear one is if you pay dividends on performance shares before the performance shares are earned, that's considered problematic as well. So the takeaway from this is, if you have one of these factors, you think you might have one of these factors present, and you're coming up on your say-on-pay vote, what can you do? Well, you can obviously consider, making changes in your pay programs to respond to that, but you could also consider preemptively reaching out to shareholders to try to, explain the reasons for the presence of these elements, if there are good reasons, or you can also focus on disclosing those types of reasons in your proxy statement. And it's important to kind of address these elements if they're present, so that investors aren't just left wondering. So moving on to the say-on-pay forecast for 2014, the one thing that really stands out as different from 2013 is just the sheer number of say-on-pay votes. As you may remember, when say-on-pay became mandatory in 2011, companies had to have a vote on frequency as well, and the options were you could have say-on-pay every year, every other year, or every third year. Most companies ended up going with annual votes, but a substantial minority did end up choosing triennial votes, and something like, I think, 19% of the Russell 3000 is the statistic I've seen. And so those companies are all going to have their second say-on-pay votes in 2014. The smaller reporting companies also became subject to say-on-pay just last year, so they're going to be having their second votes this year, assuming that they elected annual say-on-pay votes. So all that's going to combine to mean that there are going to be a lot of companies having say-on-pay votes in 2014. The practical implication of that, I guess, is just that if you do anticipate having to do shareholder outreach or talking to proxy advisors, you should perhaps consider doing that even earlier than usual, because the people who are reviewing the pay disclosures to decide how to vote are going to be potentially overwhelmed by the large number of companies having say-on-pay. Just a couple of say-on-pay disclosure considerations to highlight, just some trends and kind of best practices that we're seeing. A lot of companies have been doing voluntary pay for performance disclosures. This typically consists of some sort of graphic depiction of the company's pay to CEO pay or all NEO pay versus, say, performance measures like TSR. A lot of companies are not using, when they map pay versus performance, they're not necessarily using the summary compensation table total compensation number, because that includes equity awards at grant date fair value. A lot of companies are using realizable or realized pay instead, and those are slightly more nuanced measures. The big difference is, realizable pay typically just looks at the intrinsic value of equity awards at the end of the year. It may include equity awards, say, for the past 3 years or just that year, but and uses that value for the equity portion of pay rather than the full grant date fair value like the summary compensation table does. Realized pay is also different with respect to equity. Usually they only include in the value of pay equity awards that have been taxed in the year. So restricted stock that vested, options that were exercised during the year. It goes into the realized pay number. A couple other disclosure trends: executive summaries in CD&A and list of best practices. I think the idea with both of these is that the CD&A is typically quite lengthy, and a lot of that length is due to just complying with the SEC rules. So the thinking is, pull these elements out to the front of the CD&A so that shareholders who are interested can find them quickly and easily without hunting through the full CD&A. A couple of often overlooked disclosure requirements. In CD&A, you're required to discuss the role that your last say-on-pay vote outcome had in setting compensation. So even if you had a great say on pay vote and you didn't change anything, I think you should say that just to kind of avoid the risk of getting, an SEC comment asking whether you had overlooked that requirement or not. And then the other one is in the actual say on pay proposal in the proxy statement. There's a technical requirement that you're supposed to state the frequency of your say on pay votes and when the next vote will occur, and that is sometimes overlooked. Shareholder litigation, I just want to give a quick update on kind of where we are with shareholder litigation based on say on pay. In the last couple of years, there was this sort of wave of shareholder derivative claims that were brought in the wake of failed say on pay votes. I think there were at least dozens of companies involved, and they were subject to these. They would typically follow a say on pay vote that received less than 50% support, and they would allege breaches of fiduciary duties by the directors for maintaining these poor pay programs. Those were typically dismissed early on in the proceedings, and so nothing much came of that. Last year, there was kind of a change in tactics. These suits were more typically filed after the proxy statement was mailed, but before the meeting, and then they would focus more on disclosure allegations, like there was insufficient disclosure about the pay practices. And they would also target companies that were seeking approval for an equity plan. They would say there was insufficient disclosure about that equity plan. And then the kicker was they would seek injunctive relief to prevent the company from holding the annual meeting because there was insufficient disclosure. Again, those lawsuits were largely unsuccessful. They seem to have died down for the moment, at least. The plaintiff's firm that was behind a lot of these, however, is still sort of actively monitoring filings and is advertising that it's doing so. So yeah, possibility that these could come back or in a slightly different form, but for the moment they seem to have gone away. With that, I will hand things over to Pat to discuss ISS's updates for 2014, and then any other thoughts you have about say on pay and compensation in 2014.
Great, thanks a lot. I think it has been an interesting ride for the last couple of years following the Dodd-Frank mandate. Obviously, we had come up with the policies to address the standalone TARP recipient companies before the Dodd-Frank mandate came online, but clearly that since those were focused exclusively on banks and other financial institutions, I think that especially the peer group experience expanded to a much wider degree once you started having other sectors involved. And so given the fact that peer groups made a large part of our quantitative methodology in looking at relative pay and performance, I think for the last couple of years, there's been this annual process at ISS of revising the quantitative screens. I think a lot of it's been fine-tuning, but some of it has frankly been responding to what our clients tell us their priorities are, and those priorities have been changing. Now that we're again entering 2014 and we have these 3 years worth of experience with the broader mandate votes in place, I think most institutional investors have hit their rhythm. This hasn't become a routine voting item in any way for them, but I think they have calibrated their voting processes. And I think by and large, ISS has also calibrated our methodology for reviewing these compensation programs. Obviously, heading into the 2013 season, we took some pretty big swings at the peer group issue, and by and large, I think the reviews that we got both from the issuer community and our institutional clients have been positive, so we're pretty much status quo on peers year over year. But we did make another tweak, and this is the second time we've actually tweaked our one of our pay for performance screens, which we call a relative degree of alignment, or RDA. Essentially here, it's a peer-based comparison ranking the company's TSR versus the CEO's total pay ranking. And so, the peer group side of it will remain the same, but we tweaked the time frame that we're looking at. I think initially back in 2011 and heading into that season, we'd heard from a lot of institutions that the last thing they wanted to do in the first year of Say on Pay and the rollout was to vote against the very best performers in their portfolio. So they actually asked us to put a considerable weight on 1 year's performance, because that could be an indicator that companies had certainly turned the corner and that pay practices might have been part of that. Over the course of the last couple of seasons, we've tweaked that a little bit to emphasize more of the 3-year and less of the 1 year. And I think for the change that we're making for the 2014 season, we're completing that process. Clients have told us that this is no longer a snapshot, but a motion picture for them. They're looking at long-term stewardship of compensation. So making a sort of a straight line 3-year relative performance comparison within the peer group, I think matches where they're at now as far as how they're looking at pay and performance. Frankly, through the comment period we went through, most of the comments were less about our change in methodology than urging us to move to even a longer time frame, let's say 5 years or even beyond that. The one difficulty there is that unfortunately, peer groups tend to disintegrate given companies coming in and out of existence over time. So getting much beyond 3 years might not be the easiest thing to do, but who knows if the velocity of change in corporate America slows down, it could be we can expand that window. For most companies, you really won't see any impact of this change whatsoever. We back-tested the change over the last couple years of data, and it would have changed less than 10%, somewhere around 7% of the concern level ratings that we provide under pay for performance. And don't forget that these are just the initial steps that ISS takes in analysis. The quantitative screens help us to identify companies where there are, in our minds, higher or median levels of concern about pay for performance. But ultimately, every company that has a higher medium concern level gets a full-blown qualitative analysis. And in 2013, at least, about half of the firms overall where we had initially under the quantitative screens assigned a high concern level for pay for performance ended up getting a positive recommendation from ISS after we actually qualitatively looked at the changes that they had made in their programs and the pay for performance methodologies that they had in place. So it's still key for issuers, regardless of this minor change in our methodology, to provide a full-blown narrative from the board about how pay and performance are linked and how they're linked over time. And so for most issuers, this will be a fairly invisible change, but one that obviously you want to be aware of.
Thanks. And Rick, do you want to take a couple minutes just to talk about your thoughts on, say, on pay and compensation items in 2014?
Yeah, from the proxy solicitor viewpoint, the one thing I can't reiterate enough is that companies just cannot get complacent on this. I can't tell you how many times we hear, oh, say on pay is not an issue, we've gotten 98% for the last 3 years. And although that's great, it's kind of irrelevant when it comes to next year. Every year is a new game, and it just, you can't rest on that. And so every company really needs to be monitoring their peer groups to see what changes are being made at their peer groups as well, because while you may be standing still, your peers are making substantial changes, and you could find yourself with the target on your back. And just to kind of target again about the issue of engagement, from now, September to December is now full on, it's not proxy season, it's engagement season. And these institutional investors are being bombarded with, not only is it the group of, yes, only 2% failed, but you've got the 8% or so that are in the below 75%, they're all reaching out to these institutions. And now we've got institutions or issuers that did not fall, into the sort of the red zone are reaching out, wanting to have engagement. So we actually see institutions actually trying to kind of run a triage of who they need to speak with. So it is getting harder and harder to have dialogue with your top institutional investors at this time of year, which normally was an easy time to get at them. So the only thing I can say is engagement for the sake of engagement is foolish. Proper engagement, thoughtful engagement is helpful. And I can't, institutions continuously tell us that, issuers are are woefully ill-prepared to really have a meaningful engagement. So I would only state that it is important to really go into this engagement with knowing exactly what you need to cover, because you may only get one shot at it during this time of year with your institutional investors.
Thanks, Rick. Now we'll turn to a discussion of new rules. And the first ones we'll talk about is the Compensation Committee and Advisor Independence rules that came out of Dodd-Frank. The SEC issued rules, and then we had New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. Those rules became effective this year. The requirements need to be reflected in the Compensation Committee charter for both committee member independence and responsibilities of the committee, which we'll talk about here in a second. If you haven't updated your charter, you need to be doing that now. Turning to the independence standards, New York Stock Exchange standard, I think the key takeaway here is, unlike the audit committee rules, this is not a bright line test. It is a consideration of all the factors as to whether a director is independent from management in connection with their duties as a compensation committee member. The rules do say you need to look at other compensation paid to directors serving on the comp committee, and whether a director is affiliated with the company and its subsidiaries. But unlike the audit committee rules, those are not an absolute bar. Another area that often comes up is significant stock ownership, and that clearly is not a bar to serving on the comp committee under the new rules. NASDAQ had come out with initially rules that did include a bright line requirement, similar to the audit committee, that if there was compensation received by the director other than serving as a director, you could not be on the compensation committee. But then last week, they proposed revisions to their rule that would eliminate that bright line test, make it the same as the NYSE rules. These rules will become effective automatically within 60 days unless the SEC objects, and our expectation is that will become the rule. There's also the compensation committee responsibilities that are mandated by the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. The committee has to have the authority to retain consultants, legal counsel, other advisors. They need to be directly responsible for the appointment and oversight of the work, and they need to have appropriate funding as determined by the committee. Again, all these items need to be in the charters for the compensation committee if they aren't currently. NASDAQ does have one wrinkle, that companies must certify to NASDAQ within 30 days after the later of their annual meeting in 2014 or October 31, 2014, that they meet the new compensation committee requirements. NASDAQ has a form up on their website for purposes of making that certification. Turning to compensation committee advisor independence, the rules here require the compensation committee at the time they are selecting a consultant, legal counsel, or other advisor to take into account specified independence factors. And it's important to note here that there is no requirement that a consultant or counsel be independent. It's simply that before advice is given by the consultant or other advisor, that the committee receive information on and review and consider as part of their determination of selecting the advisor these 6 independence factors. I won't spend a lot of time on those since these have been out there for a while. People are probably familiar with them, but if you aren't, please feel free to take a look at them. As a practical matter, it's key if you're engaging the consultant for the year, if you're engaging counsel on something for the committee, make sure that you get from that advisor a letter that walks through each of these points. All the consultants are used to doing this. The law firms will do it as well. It's kind of becoming ordinary course, and so you just want to make sure that you get that for purposes of your committee determination when they're selecting advisors. From a disclosure standpoint in the proxy statement itself, what is new this year is that conflicts arising from the work of consultants and how those conflicts were addressed will need to be put into the proxy statement. This is a little different than the disclosure that had previously been mandated by the SEC in the proxy statement. It's important to note here that this requirement only applies to compensation consultants. It does not apply to counsel or other types of advisors that the committee may use. You want to keep in mind as you prepare your director and officer questionnaires that most people for a calendar year-end company will be sending out soon. You need to change the questions in there that relate to independence for compensation committee members. Some people had put language in previously in anticipation following kind of the audit committee standards, and it's obviously a little bit different now. In addition, for purposes of satisfying and determining what independence items are applicable to an advisor, you want to be asking questions about connections between directors and officers on one hand and the compensation consultant on the other hand, so that you can ferret those items out for disclosure. The next item I'll talk about real briefly is a change in the New York Stock Exchange quorum requirement. This is applicable when you have a vote on an equity plan or for if you're going to be doing a stock issuance in excess of 20% or that would result in a change in control. Historically, New York Stock Exchange required, there were two prongs to their requirement. A majority of the votes cast must have approved the matter, and the total votes cast must have represented over 50% of all the stock entitled to vote on the matter. They have now eliminated that second requirement. As a practical matter, given state law quorum requirements, you still have that to meet, and so I'm not sure there's a real material difference. But the important thing to remember here, especially if you're putting up an equity plan for a vote this year, you can't just go back to the last time you voted on it and take your voting standard and put in this year's proxy statement. You need to change it because the 50% of total votes cast requirement is no longer there and should be removed. Finally, just briefly on other Dodd-Frank rules, as most I think are probably aware, SEC has proposed CEO pay ratio disclosure rules. Those are not effective for this year. They may become effective in 2015 or maybe not until 2016, but you don't have to deal with that in this year's proxy statement. Other Dodd-Frank rules still to come. Clawback policies, when compensation is erroneously awarded, disclosure on hedging by employees and directors, and disclosure of pay versus performance rules. None of those are applicable, but many companies have adopted clawback policies. Many companies have adopted hedging policies, and this is certainly taken into consideration by ISS, the other proxy advisory firms, institutional shareholders, and if you don't have them in place, it can count as a negative, even though SEC rules requiring them are not in place yet. And so especially if you are concerned about where your say on pay vote may come out, considering adopting those types of policies would be a wise idea. Rick, anything in the new rules or proposed rules that, from your view on proxy solicitation, has a material impact?
I would comment on just the quorum requirements with the NYSE eliminating the second prong that requires an actual quorum present, 50% present on each proposal. Although, as a practical matter, this doesn't come up that often because most companies get over 50% on all voting proposals. However, this brings it in line with NASDAQ, and every now and then, there are smaller cap companies with 80, 90% retail ownership that do not get quorums on each proposal. And so this is a way of, eliminating the, the burden and the cost associated with those companies trying to make sure that they actually get a quorum on those proposals. So although it's not it doesn't happen that often, it will be helpful for some of these smaller companies.
Thanks, Rick. And Pat, same question to you as to, from your perspective, if you see any material impact here. I guess in particular, I'd be interested how much ISS, will be taking a look at compensation consultant disclosures and conflicts, and how much of that comes into play.
Sure. I guess the first one is just the change in the independence definition and the requirement for comm committees. Frankly, what the exchanges have done bring their definitions closer to ISS's definition, so there'll probably be fewer instances, especially at smaller cap companies, where we end up making recommendations against board members based upon our calculation that non-independent directors serve on the compensation panel, I think, but not much of an impact. Companies, by and large, have already adopted something pretty close to a zero tolerance policy for our non-independents on the compensation panel. I think there were only 12 instances last year where we found that there was one or more members of a compensation committee at the S&P 500 where they weren't independent. But when you moved out to the Russell 3000 universe X, the S&P 1500, there were quite a few more, about 150 companies, or 11% of that universe, where it became a factor in voting. Obviously, not every director is up every year, so it varied in the impact from firm to firm. But suffice it to say, it should reduce the number of negative recommendations that we make on that basis. Just one thing there, as long as companies are toggling their definition on compensation committees, they might just want to toggle the definition for the nominating and governance committee as well. I think it's only a matter of time before the stock exchanges are prodded in that direction. So just from a clarity standpoint, when they're trying to communicate, I think it's a lot easier for an issuer to say we have a single definition of independence that we're applying across all the key committees, rather than bifurcating or trifurcating their treatment based upon what particular panel it is. Either the director's independent in the company's view or they aren't, and that should determine whether they can serve and do serve on those committees. The consultant independence issue, I think a lot of the changes there have already been made. We've seen a huge re-engineering of the compensation consulting industry. I think the days of the full-service HR firms providing executive compensation consulting are by and large vestiges of the past, I think, and so it'll be interesting to see those new disclosures, but I frankly think what will happen is it'll even reduce more of the potential conflicts, because boards won't want to put the enhanced disclosures in their proxy statements. So the big change here may be just a closeout on the age of the full-service HR firms and the movement of all these compensation consultants towards the more independent boutique firms.
Thanks, Pat. Now we'll move to shareholder proposals, and I'll first give an overview of what's been happening. But before that, I'd like to have Pat give a talk here for a couple minutes on their policy update on board responsiveness with respect to shareholder proposals.
Sure. Again, not a huge change here, because we had telegraphed this policy change in the 2013 policy cycle. We did go ahead and put a short block on the actual implementation of that policy until the 2014 proxy season, given the fact that we wanted to give boards additional time to respond to past majority votes on shareholder resolutions. So after going through another round of surveys and review of comments on this particular policy, we decided to go ahead and implement what we had planned to implement in 2013, which was changing the vote requirement that we look at from a majority of the votes outstanding in a single year or 2 votes of majority of the votes cast to a single year of majority votes cast as the threshold for applying the policy on board responsiveness. We also made a couple tweaks in response to the comments that we got from our institutional clients and from issuers, both in the comment period but also in the roundtables that we did on the topic. The first one was to clarify that the board's rationale, what they provide sort of on a comply or explain basis in the proxy statement, is part of the case-by-case analysis. Frankly, I think it was already, but we wanted to make that explicitly clear in the policy. It's been interesting to see in this age of say on pay that institutional investors at U.S. companies, I think, are giving boards a little more leeway these days, because boards are actually coming to them and discussing the rationales behind their actions or lack thereof. And so what we tried to do is indicate that investors' views have moved on that to a degree, and so we'll be giving significant weight to that rationale. But it also means that companies and boards have to provide those rationales in the proxy statement. And then finally, we switched the policy generally from generally vote against to a case-by-case analysis, simply reflecting the fact that it is a huge framework of items that we look at in addition to that board rationale topic I talked about before. So the subject matter of the proposal, the past voting results and the level of support that's been provided, the level of engagement and outreach that has been disclosed by the board, and numerous other factors go into our determination. Like the change we made on the compensation front with RDA, I think the footprint of this will be very limited. Just looking back at 2013, applying our old vote thresholds, we only ended up recommending against a handful of companies based upon a lack of responsiveness. So the fact of the matter is most boards, and the overwhelming number of boards, in fact, are responding to shareholder proposals either by implementing the underlying reforms suggested by the vote or by engaging and making other changes that are aimed at meeting shareholders' concerns. So we'll be applying this policy on a pure case-by-case basis during the 2014 proxy statement, and we do encourage companies and boards to step up their disclosure and also their outreach to institutional investors, because that's definitely one of the factors that we're looking at in trying to make a determination whether we think a board has been responsive or not.
Thanks. Moving then to some of the major types of proposals. First one, declassifying the board. There were over 90 proposals submitted last year. Only 31 went to a vote. That's simply because most companies are agreeing to declassify their boards when they receive such a proposal, because they know otherwise, unless they have a significant number of the shares owned by insiders, that they will likely lose that vote. One thing to note, if you do get this type of proposal and you do decide to classify your board, often you can negotiate with the proponent and be allowed to do this over basically a 3-year period as the terms end. There is definitely a dichotomy here between S&P 500 companies where the classified board is virtually extinct. 89% of them had annual director elections last year. And we'll turn to the next slide here. You can see with the bar graph, smaller companies in the Russell 3000. You have a much larger portion, still over a majority are declassified, but you have 43% that are still classified. As you can see here, one proponent was behind most of these proposals that were submitted, and that most have been agreeing to declassify. To me, the real question here is how much further down in the ranks, this proponent or others, such as Vanguard, go in getting smaller companies to declassify their boards. Majority voting, as you can see here, the number being voted on has been relatively consistent over the last few years. Again, I think many companies, especially larger ones, when they get this type of proposal, make a decision to move to majority voting. A point here to note, if you get such a proposal and you decide to fight it, it would be wise to consider putting in place a director resignation policy. Because companies who put in those types of policies, at least, there are a number of institutional shareholders who, if you have put in place that policy, that may be sufficient for them. Not all holders by any means, but a company will have a much more likely chance of winning that vote if you have that type of policy in place. Again, there's a divide here between S&P 500 larger companies and Russell 3000 smaller type companies, with almost all S&P 500 companies now having majority voting. Separation of the chair and CEO roles continues to be a hot topic for shareholder proposals. As you can see here, there were a large number of them last year. You know, these we typically do see companies fight these. The last thing the chairman and CEO wants to do is to separate his or her role. This was certainly high profile at JP Morgan this last year. These proposals generally do get defeated, but there were 5 here last year where they did get majority support. Turning to proxy access, after the SEC rules were done away with on proxy access, there have been some proxy access proposals to implement proxy access at specific companies, but with only 15 of them submitted last year, this certainly has not become a large number, at least to date. I think it's important to note here the results can vary greatly. The average support is 32%, but you can see from this chart there are companies who clearly had more than a majority for this, and I think some of those were due to circumstances at those companies. Also important to note that the proposal that has received the most support is when the proponent has a proposal based on the SEC style, what would have been in the SEC rules. Holder needs to 3% for 3 years with a cap on the number of seats. I won't go into detail here on bylaw provisions for exclusive forum selection to keep things moving along. There's information here on what those are if you're not familiar with them, but if you know that you have this type of provision, this continues to be an area where shareholders bring proposals because they don't like these being put in place. Last area, kind of lumped together of these more governance types, is supermajority voting. Those types of proposals, if you have supermajority voting provisions in your articles or bylaws, receive a proposal, those get consistent, strong support, 70% average, very difficult to defeat. Action by written consent, support for that proposal has declined over time, down to an average of 40% in 2013. A lot of this will be dependent on what other provisions that you have from a governance standpoint. For example, the right to call a special meeting, which is the next one on here. That proposal averages around 50%. We have seen companies who receive those try to preempt it with their own proposal. Instead of a 10% of shares owned threshold to call a special meeting, that the shareholders will often give the proposals asking for. We see management come out and ask for it at a higher proposal as a way to try to preempt those types of proposals. The last area here is environmental and social proposals. These continue to be a very large number of the proposals filed, 40% in 2013. However, as a general matter, they continue to get relatively low support, usually not a majority and well below it. Two of the key ones last year were to have a report on political contributions and lobbying, and the other environmental sustainability types of proposals. Important to note here, though, that even though these do get relatively low votes, there are relatively high withdrawal rates for these types of proposals. And just on my own personal experience, there are companies who are certainly engaging here with the shareholders on these and coming up with negotiated middle ground positions, which you can often do on these types of proposals to help make the shareholders happy, and the company will still have to undertake some additional work and reporting, but perhaps not as much as if would have been required under the proposal. With that, I'd like to ask Rick, what trends do you see this year with respect to shareholder proposals, and are there any new ones out there?
Certainly, yeah. First, I'll just kind of cover obviously the classified board is going to be kind of mopped up by the end of this year, meaning Lucian Bebchuk with the Harvard Shareholder Rights Project will have submitted proposals at almost every S&P 500 or Fortune 500 company that has a staggered board. And really the only ones that will end up surviving with a staggered board probably at the end of the, this time next year will be companies that have either large inside blocks or various supermajority voting rights that they won't be able to dismantle their staggered board even if they try to. One thing to note, the NYSE recently changed their rules. De-staggering a board used to be considered a routine item where broker non-votes would be applied voting in favor, and the NYSE changed that. One point on proxy access. Obviously, there wasn't a lot of proposals last year, but obviously there was a clear roadmap to success for these shareholder proposals that the SEC the SEC 3-year 3% actually passed at a number of companies. We were, of course, very concerned that we were going to see a significant number of these proposals this year, and so far it does not appear that there have been a large number of proposals. One of the more interesting proposals that we're seeing that I believe is going to be submitted at a number of companies is by Shvedin, asking for a new twist on confidential voting. Confidential voting where companies aren't allowed to see how institutional investors have voted. That was a proposal from the late 80s. And now this is a new proposal, most likely stemming out of the J.P. Morgan battle over the separate chair, where the proposal is saying that the company is prohibited from seeing any voting results. So the company would not see any voting tally of how the voting is going up until the meeting date. And that, of course, companies would be completely blind to understand sort of how it is proceeding. And so it really is a proposal that would really tie up companies, and it really, to me, is just it's an unworkable situation at least from my vantage point. So that's something to be mindful of.
Thanks, Rick. Pat, how about your views from the shareholder side?
Yeah, we're not seeing a lot new coming in from the usual suspects, the large public pension funds, the labor union funds, and some of the gadfly investors. Rick talked about that confidential voting issue. It did come up at one company, a labor-sponsored proposal during 2013. I think we'll be taking a look at this new text, and when we come out with our guidance on new or revised shareholder proposals in January, this will probably be one of the issues, or at least we give an FAQ, if not more guidance out on. But there's not likely to be a lot of sort of those moving issue changes to our policy, simply because we're not seeing a great deal of creativity with the new issues coming online. A lot of my observations, frankly, echo what Rick talked about before. I think you can almost replace the word shareholder proposals with shareholder proposals and engagement, because it seems as though it's those two different categories. Most of the companies that are approached now on calling for annual elections or calling for majority voting are withdrawing the proposals, or proposals aren't even necessary. The companies are just going ahead and making the change. We actually saw more than 100 firms in 2013 have charter or bylaw changes on their ballot on the management proposal side of the equation, compared to the only 30 or so shareholder resolutions that showed up on ballots. So some of those issues, I think engagement has really replaced shareholder resolutions, or is in the process of doing so. It also applies to some of the E&S topics like board diversity and political contributions, where following discussions or engagements with the activist, companies are making a lot of changes, either substantive changes or changes in their disclosure practices. On the other side of the ledger, where we're going to see continuing shareholder proposal activities are the areas where we don't see a lot of engagement. So independent share, even though it didn't see a huge burst in voting support last year and actually saw a slight drop on an average basis year over year, we'll continue to see big numbers because it's something that some of the activists feel passionately about, and so they'll continue to push it even if they don't see majority support on their resolutions. Although, given the bumper crop we saw, we did see an uptick in the number of majority votes on that topic last year, and that I think that encouraged some of the proponents. Calls for lobbying disclosure, I think that'll supplant the political spending disclosure proposals in numbers in the 2014 proxy season, simply because we see very little in terms of negotiated settlements on the lobbying disclosure side of the equation, because most companies just don't provide a lot of disclosure there. A couple of other topics that have been on ballots for years, compensation-related shareholder proposals dealing with pro rata vesting, that is limiting the accelerated vesting of options and other equity awards following a change of control, will continue to pick up steam, as will proposals asking companies to put holding periods or retention requirements in place for executive stock holdings. And in fact, I would expect both of those issues to eclipse the number of proposals that actually hit ballots next year on majority voting and the repeal of classified board structures. The axis remains that head scratcher. I think very strong results, as were discussed before, but we're just not hearing a lot of the proponents planning to offer resolutions on that topic for 2014. So I do think that we'll see an explosion in the number of those resolutions someday, but I just don't think it's going to be next season, perhaps in the 2015, 16, 17, or beyond. It'll finally catch fire, but right now it's still just kind of smoke and not a lot of fire as far as actions at annual meetings coming up. One issue I did want to touch on, and it impacts the quorum issue and the slides you had up concerning exclusive venue and also some of these new director compensation bylaws. One real flashpoint I see coming in to play in 2014, potentially a lot of companies, is accountability, in that boards seem to be adopting a lot of bylaw changes unilaterally without not only seeking shareholder approval, but even doing outreach to their institutional holders. And I have a bad feeling, having talked to some of our institutional clients, that we may see some vote no activity aimed at those boards, or just general no votes being cast by institutional investors, not because they necessarily disagree with the action the board took, but simply because the board either did not put it up for a shareholder vote or didn't engage with shareholders to gain their views on these issues before they took the unilateral action. So I would advise corporate issuers and frankly their advisors as well to sort of stop, look, and listen there before they just go ahead and adopt something as housekeeping, quote unquote, because I think it could lead to some significant problems next season in terms of sort of unanticipated significant withholding against votes for directors.
Thanks, Pat. Jennifer, do you want to make your CLE announcement now? and then we'll
Yes,
finish up with Q&A.
Okay. Those seeking Kansas, New Jersey, or New York CLE credit are required to use the following 4-digit code to complete the attorney affirmation form. The code is FM1P. That's F as in Frank, M as in Michael, the number 1, and P as in Paul. To obtain a copy of the affirmation form, download it from the Files box at the right-hand side of your screen or email Jennifer Bartz at jbartz@foley.com. Once again, the code for the attorney affirmation form is FM1P. That's F as in Frank, M as in Michael, the number 1, P as in Paul. This code is only needed for those requesting CLE in Kansas, New Jersey, or New York. This concludes our CLE announcement.
Thanks. Q&A, we do have a few questions. We're basically out of time here. Did want to at least respond to one of them because I think it's pretty straightforward. Maybe Josh, you could respond to it and tell us whether or not it's so straightforward. Does the compensation committee advisor evaluation review of the independence factors need to be done once upon selection or on an annual basis was the question.
Right, and I guess you might almost divide the advisors into two camps for purposes of this. The consultants, I think the answer is clearly that it should be done on an annual basis because you have that disclosure in the proxy statement every year about any conflicts that have arisen from the work of the consultant during the year, and you have to make that disclosure every year. So I think kind of hand in hand with that, you'd be doing an evaluation of the independence of the consultant on a yearly basis. Then for other advisors like legal counsel, the rule doesn't actually require that the evaluation be done, be renewed or periodically. It just says before selecting the advisor, you need to do this evaluation. But again, as a practical matter, I guess maybe it depends on if your committee is regularly engaging legal counsel throughout the year, or they want to have them available, then it probably makes sense to do it annually. So that you don't have to kind of ask the question, is this a new selection of the advisor because it's been so long since the last time, and you can do it at the same time as you do your consultant evaluation and just put it on the committee calendar, and then it's not a big deal.
Thanks, Josh. With that ends our remarks for today. Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you for closing.
All right, thanks, John. Thanks to all of our panelists for your insights regarding the 2014 Proxy Season Preview. The contact information for each of our panelists is on the slide deck if you'd like to reach out to one or more of them. The PowerPoint and recording will be available on our NDI website by early next week. Please mark your calendar for the sessions in our 2014 NDI Checkpoint Web Conference series on February 19th. May 21st, August 20th, and December 3rd. And don't forget, those seeking Kansas, New York, and or New Jersey CLE credit are required to complete the attorney affirmation form. Please email the code to jbartz@foley.com to get a copy of the form, or simply click the download files button in the box along the right side of your screen. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation and ask that you take 30 seconds to participate in our brief online survey. These surveys are important to us as they help us in providing practical advice and recommendations for developing ideas for future NDI topics. Thank you again for attending our NDI, and we'll talk to you next on February 19th, 2014. Program details will be announced early in 2014.